Now that we're more confident with modeling in Blender, we're going to take this to the next level, creating a dinosaur. Organic shapes can be tough, but we'll use background images to aid the design process. It's common to use background images to help us make objects, so it's a great thing to learn early on. The modeling in this section will start to get a little bit more difficult, so don't panic if your shape isn't quite the same as mine. As long as the fundamentals are there, you should be absolutely fine. If you are finding this section tough though, I would suggest trying out a few other more low poly models, as I mentioned at the end of the previous section, to consolidate your skills. Again, you can check my YouTube channel. I've got a playlist for low poly modeling, and you could try out following along with some of those. We also in this section create a landscape for the dinosaur, so it's another chance to practice the work from earlier sections. Remember to use the community support if you're getting stuck, as there's teaching assistants on there who are very experienced with many of the common problems. So let's build a scary dinosaur. In this lecture, we'll be bringing some background images into Blender so we can easily trace around a shape for our dinosaur. So I'm in a completely new startup file, and to bring my references in, I can have my folder open with the T-Rex front and T-Rex side images, and those are available with the lecture, and I can click and drag one of them into the scene. Now within Blender we have what's called an empty. As you can see in the outliner on the right hand side, it's coming perpendicular to my viewport, so level with where my view was. And we've got some options down the bottom here in the object data properties, which I'll talk about in a moment. So take a moment to catch up with me and drag in the front image of the T-Rex. Pause the video and have a go at that. First of all, I want to line this up, and in order to do that, I can press Alt-R to remove any rotation and Alt-G to remove any movement or grabbing. That will place it right in the center like this. I'll also delete my default cube because we don't need that. Select my empty and RX90 to move it upright. I'll come into front view and zoom in a touch, and G to grab and move that just above the floor. Now I can't very easily see my floor, and that's where the settings on the side here under the object data properties are very helpful, because I can click the opacity and bring the opacity down so I can see the grid behind it. And I find somewhere like 0.2, 0.25 is about right. So now I can press G to grab and move that downwards slightly, just so it intersects the floor there. And let's zoom in a touch, G to grab in the X and move that to the center line there. So it's nicely lined up. So pause the video here and catch up with me and place your front image of your T-Rex into position. And remember to use the opacity under the object data properties. Now my dinosaur is about 2.5 meters. I believe they're around 3 meters tall, so I can scale this up, and I can scale it around the 3D cursor, which is in the center still. If I press Shift S, I can move the cursor to world origin to make sure that's the case, and I can come up to my transform pivot point options and change it to 3D cursor. Now when I scale, it will scale around the floor, and I can move it up to 3 meters, which is this point here. So there I've got my background image in place. I'm going to press G then Y to move it back slightly, about 2 Blender units, so I can model in front of it here. Okay, so pause the video and catch up with me. Scale your T-Rex so it's 3 meters tall, and remember to scale by the transform pivot point using the 3D cursor. Okay, so let's bring in the side image. I'll bring back my resource folder, and instead of clicking and dragging it in with my viewport just randomly positioned, I can go to side view with 3 on my numpad. Now bring up that folder and click and drag it in. That way it's positioned correctly, although I would prefer to have it facing the other way, so RZ180 to face the other way. And once again into side view and turn down the opacity in the object data properties, so somewhere around 0.2. And let's start positioning this into a good location. Somewhere around here. I've still got my transform pivot set to the 3D cursor, so I can scale it up so it becomes 3 meters tall. So around there. And lastly, just move that across in the X, so GX -2. So we can now model our dinosaur in the middle here and have these in the background. Now there is another useful thing we can do, and that is only make it visible in orthographic mode. So if I turn off perspective for the side image, it's only visible when I go to side view like this. And when I go to perspective view, it disappears. That can be slightly helpful if the background starts getting distracting. I'll turn that back on for the moment though, so it makes it easier to follow along. So now's a good time to catch up with me and bring in your side image and place it into position. Pause the video and have a go at that. And the last thing we can do is in our outliner, under the filter options here, if I click the down arrow there, the restriction toggles, if I turn on selectable and then move back over my outliner, you can see I've now got this icon here and I can turn off the selectability of those objects. So I can't click on them and select them unlike I can with the other objects in my scene. And that's very useful for when I'm trying to edit my model here, I don't select the background images. You may also want to label these, so there's my front there, so I can double left click on that and call it front, and this one is side. It doesn't make too much difference because we're not selecting them. So make sure you've caught up with me and you've made your front and side images non-selectable. Once you've done that, make sure you've saved your work, ready for next time. In this lecture, we're creating the dinosaur body, and we'll be doing that by adding a plane and tracing around our background images, then adding a mirror and joining the two sides together. Okay, so here's where we got up to last time. And in order to make my dinosaur, I'm going to actually start with a plane. So I'm going to trace the side image here with a plane and then extrude it out to give it this depth of the front image. So with my 3D cursor in the center, Shift S, of course, to move that back to the world origin, I can press Shift A to add, mesh, and then plane. Now I want this to be upright so it matches my dinosaur, so RY90 will put it in the right position. Let's now go to side view with 3 on my numpad, and I can start positioning this and placing it to coincide with my dinosaur. Now one thing to do before that is if I press N on my keyboard and go to item, remember we've got that Y rotation. I might as well apply that now so we don't have any problems in the future when we come to mirror this. So Control A and apply rotation. That way we're all set back to 0. Let's go into edit mode now with tab. I'll move in a bit. I'll press N to get rid of the side panel as well. And also I'll go to X-ray mode here so I can see my background. So now's a good place to catch up with me and place your plane into position. Also remember to apply the rotation. Now I'm going to start off with the body and the head. I won't be doing the arms and legs just yet. So I'll select the vertex, G to grab and move that into position, and one here, one there, and one here. Now the reason I've put it in this position is to show you how many cuts you need. There's a big change in the direction of the body here, so I need another vertex here, so I can do a loop cut down the middle here. So Control R to do a loop cut, double left click to set that, and move that vertex into position. And I'm imagining the underneath is around here. So I'm mapping fairly close to the outline, but not too much. There's a bit of overlap there, as you can see. That's absolutely fine. And this sort of size face is about right, especially in this body part. Now I can select these two vertices here, E to extrude and pull that out. I can press S to scale. Oh, actually I've still got it on the 3D cursor. So I'll just quickly change that back to median point and undo that change there and scale again. So they come into about here. And again, you can see my reference kind of underlapping the shape. That's absolutely fine. So I'll extrude this out to the end and adjust the position of these vertices as I go. So E to extrude out, sometimes scaling, sometimes just pressing G to grab. When you get to the end, just create a point like this. You don't need to merge them together, just square them off like this. That's absolutely fine. So back to side view and extrude out the other way. And I'll speed this up a bit because it's quite repetitive. Now you might find as it curves around the shape that you're going to get shorter edges on one side to another. That's fine. And again, we will adapt the shape a lot as we go along. So we're just getting the base in for now. I'm not including the mouth. I'll cut that in a bit later on, but I've roughly got the outline shape here. So you can see what that looks like. So we start off nice and simple and then we build up the complexity as we go. So pause the video here and trace the outline of the body and the head in the same way I have done here. Okay, so I'm going to go back to side view and just zoom in on the head for a moment. Now there's a couple of ways of doing this. We can cut the mouth in now and then extrude out, or we could cut it in after we've extruded. I find it a little bit easier if we cut it in now. So what I'm going to do is press Control R and do a loop cut all the way through the body. I'll just cancel that and show you that it's going all the way through. So Control R all the way through like this. I'm generally quite careful about adding an edge loop all the way through the object like this, because the more edge loops, it means you have more topology to move around and adapt and change the shape. So you want to try and add as little as possible and only when you really need to. So obviously I need to add some around the mouth, but it does help to have some down the middle here, because then we can eventually move these outwards and create a curve to the body. So back to side view and back into the head here. Now these points are going to line up with the top of the mouth like this. Then I can use my knife tool to cut out the bottom one. So K for knife tool, and remember it's always a good idea to start on a vertex. So I'll start here and cut through all these edges here until I get to the end around here and press enter. And let's just move these back into position, and that looks good. So pause the video here and do a loop cut through the middle, and then use your knife tool to cut the bottom of the jaw. Now around the head we've got a fair bit of detail. We've got an eye socket here, a nostril here, we've got this sort of jaw linking thing here, but there's a fair bit more detail than there is in the aspects of the body. So we can add a few more loop cuts in here if we need to. So again, I'll zoom in and I could press Ctrl R to have one down here, but because I've done that cut, it won't cut all the way through my shape. Well, this is actually okay for the moment. It still actually is in quads, so 4-sided faces, which is optimal. And I can use this to kind of reposition my vertices around the head like this, and maybe this one down here. This is a bit of a big overlap here, so Ctrl R and do a loop cut down there, and I can create an extra one up here. I think an extra one down here as well, so Ctrl R, then I can just move these into position, ready for this sort of strange inside piece of skin inside the mouth. So pause the video here and mark out the outline for the mouth. You can use both the knife tool and the loop cut tool with Ctrl R in order to create that outline. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so I'm going to go to face mode now and select these faces within the mouth, including these ones here. If I want to do this sort of strange piece of skin, then I can do that once we've joined the shape together. But for now, I'll just create the whole opening. So delete faces, and we're following the outline reasonably well. So what I want to do now is to give it some volume, so extrude it outwards. I'll go to front view with 1 on my keyboard, and you can just about see my shape there, right in the middle, in line with the object center there. So if I were to create a mirror, it would be right on top of itself. I need this to be out here somewhere, so it creates a mirror on the other side, and we can kind of extrude them and join them together. So with everything selected, you can either box select or press A to select all. I can press G to grab and move it outwards. Remember, we're still in the edit mode, so our object origin is not moving, and we'll bring it out to somewhere in the middle of the shape. So I can start extending the belly out and pushing the face back inwards a little bit later on. So it's just sitting slightly wide of the object origin. Now when I come to the modifiers, where the spanner is, add modifier mirror, that jumps across to the other side. Now do be aware, if you see it down here, then that may be because you've forgotten to apply your rotation. If I go to object mode, press N on my keyboard, if you've got anything set here, then that's going to affect your mirror. Okay, so back into edit mode, and I want to extrude and join these shapes together. So I need to go to edge mode and Alt left click to select the edge loop on the outlines, and Shift Alt left click to select this one as well. So I'm trying to get all the edges on the outline. Once I've got all those, I'll come back to the front here. I'll also turn X-ray off because it's a bit easier to see, and turn clipping on, so when I extrude them out, it will clip together in the middle. So E to extrude, pull them out and into the middle there. I'll press X so it constrains to the X-axis like this, and left click. And now we have a solid dinosaur. So pause the video here, select all your faces and move them out away from the center slightly, then add your mirror and then extrude the outline edges inwards to complete the dinosaur shape. Okay, so one last thing I just want to make you aware of. I'm going to come up to the overlays up the top here and turn on face orientation, and it's all blue, which is good. I'll just select everything and press Shift N and tick on the inside option there. If you were to see that it was all red, that would mean that the normals are facing the wrong way and we would have to flip them round. It's usually fairly straightforward. I can press Shift N and it recalculates those normals on the inside. The reason that might happen is that the initial plane we started, if we had rotated it the other direction, the normals would be facing inside. But it so happens that our face direction ended up being correct for this model. But it's something to be aware of, that face direction can cause you problems later on down the line, especially when you're texturing your objects or rigging your objects and things like that. So do go up to the overlays and check your face orientation. If you see any red, then select it all, Shift N to recalculate the normals on the inside. Now, one other point I'd like to make, I'm going to turn off the face direction now and go back to X-ray mode and back to edit mode. Now, occasionally people have inside faces. So if I go to edge mode, select this edge and this edge here and press F to fill, there is now an inside face. Let's go to face mode and you'll be able to see that. So if I select away, you can still just about see that face there, and you can see a bit of flicker on my lines here. This sometimes happens when people extrude and then try and cancel that extrusion but don't realize that it's still there, and there's other reasons why it might happen as well. But do make sure you go in and just check that you haven't got any inside faces by just selecting them and pressing delete and then faces. So just have a quick look around, make sure you haven't got any inside faces there. You may want to hide your background images just so it's a little bit easier to see, and I can see there's no inside faces. Another useful thing to do, if I press A to select all and then M to merge vertices by distance, this will get rid of any vertices that are right on top of each other. So if I tick by distance, we can see that it hasn't removed any, so I didn't have any doubles in my shape. But that can sometimes clean up your shape if you have any extrusions that were right on top of each other but didn't create an inside face. So take a moment to check for any inside faces and delete them, and press M to merge by distance so that it gets rid of any doubles. Once you've done that, make sure you've saved your work, ready for next time. In this lecture, we'll be giving some curves to our boxy dinosaur body. Okay, so here's where we got up to last time, and I'm going to bring my front and side reference images back in, and I'll quickly go to front view with one on my keyboard, and you can see that we're not lined up very well with the shape from the front. If I go to side view, it's nice and mapped out, but front view, we need to bring the body out and some parts of the head inwards. What would be helpful though, if I come around to the side here, I want to be able to select faces along here, for example, and then move them about, but I don't want to keep jumping from this view and then jumping back to front view. You can do it like that, but it's much easier if I separate my view into two. Also, we don't need the timeline at the bottom, so I can click and drag at the bottom corner here and drag over the top of my timeline to get rid of that. And at the bottom corner, once again, I can click and drag out a new window like this. I'll give myself a little bit more room on this side because I'll come around to perspective view here, and let's zoom in on our image in front view just here. Also, I'll press T to get rid of the toolbar. Remember, you can bring that back with this tiny arrow here, and T is the shortcut to get rid of that. And lastly, I'm going to come across the top here and turn off wireframe for my perspective. I think it's a bit easier to see what's going on and my shape in general. I don't want to do that on the left hand side because I need to map this to my reference. Okay, so pause the video here and catch up with me and change your layout so it's the same as mine. So let's start with something like the top of the face here, and I'll control click to this face over here and zoom in just a touch, and I'll zoom in on that section on my side view, and you can see the back end of the top of the jaw is roughly in the right place, but the front end needs to come right into here. So I can start by pressing G then X to move it in just a tiny bit to there, and then I can press R then Z, so I'm rotating around the Z axis, and I'm pulling the front inwards. Make sure you start off by looking at the perspective view, so the view on the right hand side, to know which way you're rotating, because it's a little bit awkward to see in side view. And if we look at the very top of the perspective screen, and you can see my rotation is negative, so I could bring that all the way in to somewhere around here. Do remember that in the reference image, this part here that's been drawn is the very front of his snout. Let's take a quick look around in perspective view, and that looks about right. Let's work on the bottom jaw now. So I'll go from this one here to the end there, and I've just noticed it's sticking out slightly there, but we'll sort these minor things out later on. We're just getting the rough shape to start off with. So I'll zoom in on that, and again, R to rotate in the Z, make sure I'm going in the negative number there, so somewhere around there, and then G then X to pull that across to around about there. Let's just take a look and see what that looks like. I would say that's not quite right, so I'm just going to press G then X, move that out slightly, and R then Z to rotate it a bit further, just so it's a little bit wider at the bottom there, and maybe G then X to move that in just a touch, so the bottom is roughly the same size. Again, we'll sort out these minor things later on, and the jaw is going all the way back in the correct place. So pause the video here and try and line your dinosaur's mouth up so it angles inwards towards the front of its snout. Okay, so next we need to think about the body, so I'll select these faces around about here and just zoom out just a touch, and G then X to move those outwards. So I'll move them roughly in line with the widest part there, but it's not quite right because this bit is sticking out a lot. So I'll go to Edge Mode and select these two, and G to grab in the X and move those right inwards like this. We're very roughly there. These two probably need to come in a little bit more, so G then X and that's fine for the moment. We'll add the sort of curve around the top later on. Next is these two here, and I can bring those out, and they seem to be around the leg position, so they can come out fairly wide to here. So you can see the leg just behind us there. And then we want to start curving inwards towards the tail. So I can select these two, G then X. And I think it will be beneficial to bring our tail into a point now. So I'll select these edges here, and I want to merge them all into a point in the middle here. Before you do that though, remember to turn on Auto Merge Vertices. That way when I bring them into the center there, all the vertices will merge. So G then X, bring those in, and we come to a point. Now what I can do is select these two edges here, turn on proportional editing in the middle here. The shortcut is O, and I can press G then X, and remember to use the wheel of your mouse to edit the circle of influence, as I call it. And then we can bring those in to somewhere around here, I would say. And we've roughly mapped out the shape in the X-axis. Now if I come down to here, we've got a triangle at the top there, so it's not optimal geometry at the moment. But those are things you can easily sort out once you start getting the shape a bit more. Let's sort out the height of the tail now. So I'll come to vertex mode, and I can bring these two up. So GG to edge slide to bring that up, and GG to edge slide. So they come into a point there. So yes, we have lots of triangles at the end. And like I say, we'll sort those out later. And they've all merged together as one because I've got auto merge vertices on. Okay, so let's just quickly check how that's going. And we can see roughly from top view that we've got roughly the right shape, although it is very square at the moment. So pause the video and catch up with me sorting out the body and the tail. Okay, let's think about those curves then. There's a fairly straightforward way to add a bit of curve to your shape. If I go to edge mode and select the one just before the end there and the one at the end there, I can't select this one, and you'll see why in a second, but we're going all the way to the end here, and I press GG to edge slide one way. Oh, I'll turn off proportional edit for this. So up the top here, turn that off. GG to edge slide one way and GG to edge slide the other. And can you see that creates a curve? And you can see why I couldn't use this one, because it won't edge slide in the same way because it's got a point at the end here. So the same for the bottom. So I'll select this one all the way to the end here, and that's by control left clicking, and GG to edge slide one way and GG to edge slide the other way. And that rounds out the body really nicely. So pause the video and catch up with me, rounding out the shape of your dinosaur's body. Okay, lastly, we can just adapt the shape slightly. We can see that this is slightly out up here. So let's just quickly take a look at that. It doesn't really look too bad in 3D, so I'm not too worried about it. And I might not stick too much to the reference image there, because I think maybe his shoulders in the reference image ought to be a little bit broader anyway. So that's fine. The top of the jaw does seem to be sticking out a little bit here, and we can see that in the reference image here. So G then X to move that across. And I'll zoom in on that with period key on my numpad just to see what that's looking like. And I think generally speaking, we're looking okay. And again, we can tidy that up a little bit later. Make sure you have a really good look around in all angles to check the shape. Let's just look across the tail as well. This one seems to stick out a bit, so I can Alt left click to select all those and G to grab in the X to move those inwards slightly. And just sort out any sort of kink along here, G then X for these ones as well. And these last ones, G then X. And that's a little bit smoother down there. And that's looking much better where it is now. So your challenge then is to go around your shape, tidying any areas up that aren't quite matching the reference images or are sticking out in unnatural ways. Once you've done that, make sure you've saved your work, ready for next time. In this lecture, we'll be making the back legs of our dinosaur. So here's where we got up to last time, and I'm going to change the perspective to side view, zoom in so I can see the leg area and change back to wireframe. Now I'll go into vertex mode and I'll just start thinking about where I want the leg to protrude from in terms of which faces to choose. It looks like this face is the obvious face, so I'll just move those vertices into a better position to line up with that leg. Now the actual attachment of the leg to the body is probably in here somewhere, but because this is quite low poly, we can make this area fairly big just to match our reference roughly. So if I go to face mode now with 3 and choose this face here, you can see that I'm not choosing the inside face here. I'll just quickly turn off wireframe with Alt Z. So the leg is coming out from this direction here, not this one here. That's important because if I extrude from here now, they're attached together for one. Even if I were to turn off clipping, and move them outwards, I would need to fill this face in here, and there should always be a gap between the legs. So I'll undo those steps and choose this one here. And let's go back to side view and to wireframe once again. What would also be helpful is to have a loop cut down here. So I'll press Ctrl R and do a loop cut there, and I'll just move this edge so it lines up with the back. I could even move these two along as well to give it a bit more curvature. So now if I go back to face mode, I've got these two faces here. Again, I'll go into solid mode so you can see what I'm doing here. If I extrude out now, I've got 6 edges for the dinosaur's leg that will give me more options when it comes to making it a more rounded shape. I'll undo that for now. If I were to just choose one and extrude out, and then extrude the leg out here, you can see that I've got no options to try and round this out, and it looks very blocky. So I'll undo those steps and select these two. And now's a good time for you to catch up with me. First, edit the face so that it matches reasonably well with the background. You don't have to be precise. And then do a loop cut down the middle of it. So we're going to choose 2 faces to extrude from. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so now with those faces selected, I can do exactly as I say, extrude outwards. Now, if we look at the side image here, I'm extruding out this way. I'm not extruding straight down. I'm extruding out first, and then I choose the faces underneath, and that's when I start extruding downwards. It looks a bit strange at the moment, but we'll change the shape as we go. So that's important to understand, that we extrude out first, and then extrude the faces that we've created at the bottom there. So I'd like to pause the video here and just catch up with me, making sure you've got that first step correct. Okay, now I'll go to side view once again, and I'll go to wireframe, so Alt Z, and also I'll minimize this dialog box so it only appears down here now. Zoom in on my leg and start repositioning our leg. So G to grab. I'm going to press scale, but Shift X because I don't want to make it any thinner. So it's not making it any thinner over here. So it's roughly lining up with this area here. It's still very rough at the moment. And I'll press G to grab and move it outwards slightly over here. And also I'll rotate it so it's roughly in line there. And rotate it this way very slightly as well. So I'm often jumping between my 2 views. Now I'll press E to extrude and bring it down to here and across to here and scale in the Y. Then I'll rotate it so it's roughly in line, somewhere around there, and I can scale in the X on my side view here and bring that across. And I'll minimize this dialog box here as well and just zoom in a touch so you can see it a little bit easier. Once again, I'm setting it in side view and then going across to front view to line it up. So E to extrude downwards from here, and I can scale again in the Y, bring that in, and over in my side view, G to move it across to somewhere around here. So once again, take a moment to catch up with me and extrude your leg out to the ankle. Remember to jump from side view to front view and roughly line it up in both. So for the next bit, I'll extrude downwards to the bottom here, and I can scale these faces out in the X-axis so they come out to here. And at this point, I'm going to use the front face just here, if I can grab that just there, and extrude that outwards for a foot. So back to side view, E to extrude, G to grab, and scale in the Z. It's sort of digging into the floor there. I don't really want that, so I'll keep it fairly flat along the bottom there. And I'll scale it out in the X for my side view here. I'll just grab this bottom edge here. So 2 to go to edge mode, grab that bottom edge, and then scale it in the X for front view just there. I won't do the claws just yet. I'll leave those for a moment because we'll want to create some loop cuts in here for those. So pause the video, catch up with me, and create the foot. So now I'll press Alt Z to go back to solid mode and just start rounding things out a little bit. So 2 to go to edge mode, select these 2, I'll scale them in a bit, and GG to bring them down slightly. Let's look at side view, bring them across. And I'll generally use the right hand view now for perspective and just make sure things are lining up in side view over here. I can bring this one up a little bit. Vertex mode, GG to slide that. Maybe this one around a bit. This one in just a touch and just adapting it a tiny bit so the shape looks correct. I want to create a bit more of a curve around the inside here. We've got this extra edge loop in there. So I can select from here down to here and press GG to edge slide and GG to edge slide back, and that creates a bit of a curve. I can do the same from here down to here as well. So once again, GG to edge slide and GG to edge slide. And now for the back of the leg, I can select from here right down to the bottom this time and GG to edge slide again. And I want to do the same inside here. I'll just hide the front and side so I can easily see it. From there down to there, GG to edge slide, and see how that's looking. That's not too bad. Bring those references back. So pause the video here and do any adaptations, particularly to the top of the leg, so it roughly lines up with our reference. Again, I'm saying roughly, it doesn't have to be precise. You can also just go by eye and think, does that look like a leg? And move some vertices around into position, so it does start looking more like a leg. And also grab these edge loops around the very corners and use the edge slide technique to curve your mesh slightly. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, once we've got that rough shape, we can now start adding a little bit more topology to help the shape out. So I'll go to side view again and Alt-Z to go to wireframe, and I'll move the shape back a little bit so it matches our reference a bit more, and just a little bit of adjustment here around the knee. And it might look a long way out at the moment, but once we add some more loop cuts in here, we can start molding it to the shape a bit more. It's very important that you don't start adding too much topology too early on, otherwise you take up a lot more time moving all those vertices. So we're way off the knee here, so I can press Ctrl R to do a loop cut around here, or I could choose this edge loop going around here and Ctrl B to bevel. Bevel can sometimes help because it creates more of a curve, and I can create an extra loop cut down the middle here, and then left click and then move that across a little bit. And you can see it's got a bit more shape to it than just adding a loop cut, moving it, adding another loop cut and moving it, and so on. Now I can go in and select some of these verts together and move those into position, and some at the back here as well. And these two here, remember to box select because you've got one behind the other, and then I can move this down as well. Just check what that's looking like in perspective view. Alt-Z to go to solid mode, and it's not looking too bad. We just need a little bit of adjustment in some of these areas, and that's working reasonably well. Okay, back to side view, and let's select the edge loop around here. I'll press Alt-Z to go back into X-ray mode, Ctrl B to bevel, so I can create that curve around here. You might find that you want to create a few, so 3 loop cuts like this, and then I can go in and start adjusting those as I see fit. I'll just jump across to my side view as well here and make sure they're lining up. And remember that you can scale them down. I'll press Shift Z so it doesn't go in the Z axis. And you can rotate when you select a group like this as well. And we're getting there. Alt-Z to go to solid mode. It's not looking too bad. Let's just quickly go into object mode, deselect all, and I'll hide the front and side images to see how we're getting on. And it's looking fairly good. We can always adjust these things as we move further on. So your challenge then is to catch up with me and try and get the shape of these legs so that they roughly match the reference image and generally look like dinosaur legs. Once you've done that, make sure you've saved your work, ready for next time. In this lecture, we'll be working on the claws for our dinosaur. Okay, so here's where we got up to last time, and I'll bring back my front and side images. And something that might be useful is to put them into a collection, so I can right click in the outliner, new collection, call this reference, drag both those in, and then I only need to press one I this time to hide them both. So I'll select my dinosaur, and looking at it, his legs are very thin at the moment, but we'll sort that out in a moment. I think in the reference image, the side view was a bit too thin there, but we'll go into edit mode, and we'll come to the front of our foot here. So I'll press period key on the numpad to zoom in on that, and the same in front view just here. Now don't follow along with this, but what we could do is do a couple of loop cuts, Ctrl R, and then 2 loop cuts there, and then we could extrude out these faces, making 3 claws. The problem with this is that we get an awful lot of topology going up and around our leg. We could just cut this off and make a triangle here. That's perfectly fine, and that's one way of doing it. But there's another, probably more simple way. So I'll undo those loop cuts. And what I'm going to do in front view is scale in the X, so it's the size of one claw like this. Then I'll go to face mode and select this outer face here, E to extrude in the X, and I'll bring that out. I'm looking at the front view as well at the moment and bringing it out so it's roughly the size of a claw. So somewhere around there, we'll adapt it again in a second. And this one here as well, E then X to move that out. And again, looking at my front image to see how far I'm going, and somewhere around there. If I go to edge mode, you can see that my back edges are far too far out, but we can easily adjust those. So with the inside one first, I can press GG to edge slide and bring that in this way. Same with this one back here, GG, edge slide, and bring that in like this. And you can see we've got 3 faces on the front ready for our claws. So pause the video here, make the front of your foot nice and small so it's in the middle, and then extrude the 2 sides out, making 3 edges at the front for the claws. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so before I go any further and bring out the claws, I'll adjust the leg a bit so it looks a bit thicker. So Alt-Z to go to wireframe, and I'll select all these, scale in the X, bring them out slightly, and I'll scale in the Y as well. So S then Y, and bring them out slightly there. And maybe just adapting some of these. So G then Y to bring that out a bit further. And this one here as well, G then Y. So it's got a bit more thickness to it. Perhaps a little bit more at the front, G then Y. And have a good look around. This edge along here, I need to scale in the X, so it's a lot wider at the front there. And this vertex just here, and come to think of it, the whole edge up to there, G then X to bring that out. So it's looking a bit better. I think this one needs to come out just a touch as well, G then X. It's a little bit tricky to see, but I'll press Alt-Z to come out of wireframe so you can kind of see where the foot's going there. And if I go into wireframe, and I think these ones here, just G then Z, because they don't really have a heel at the back here, it sort of curves into the foot. We could bring all these up slightly like this, I believe. What might help you at this point is actually looking at some reference images of some T-Rex. So there's one here, and you can see their heel is actually right up here, and this is kind of their toes that they stand on when they're running. And you can see also that this particular one has quite thick legs. So maybe I can afford to bring these out further, so G then Y, bring those out a little bit more like this. Perhaps a tiny bit more thickness around the front here, so I'll extend these out a touch, and just modify it until I'm more comfortable with it. Okay, let's go back to solid mode with Alt-Z and see how that's looking. I think that's looking a lot better. I'll just press O to go to proportional edit and press G, change my circle of influence. I think they need to be a little bit less inwards there, so there's a bit more substance to them like this. Looks like they're a bit stronger when they're like this. Okay, so that's a lot better now. Now we can concentrate on the claw area. And what I want to do is make this nice and even at the bottom here. So let's go to side view. Oh, turn on proportional edit with O, G then X to move these back in, and these ones as well, G then X to move those back in, so they're nicely in line. And I'm just thinking about the height of the claws. I think that's going to be okay. We can kind of accentuate the claws, stylize it a bit, make it look a bit more scary. So I'll leave them nice and big and tall like that. Lastly, it's just these 2 here. We want to even these up so they're nice and even. So with those 2 selected, scale in the X, bring those in, and just do a little bit of edge sliding. So double tap G, and we've got 3 even faces like this. Okay, so take a moment to adapt the shape, maybe look at a couple of reference images and see what you think about the size of the legs, and then make sure that your 3 faces at the front of the foot, ready for the claws, are nice and even. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, I'm just going to quickly go to side view to make sure that I'm lined up in the right position for the claws, and then come back to perspective. I'll go to face mode with 3 and select these 3 faces. I can't extrude now because that will keep the faces together. So if I grab this one, G to grab, it sticks to the others. So I'll undo that. And now I need to inset these faces so I can extrude out the claws. So I to inset, but that's insetting them all together. And then I again for individual. So I can bring them into here and then extrude out in the Y axis for some claws. Let's go to side view now so I can see how far I'm going. So G then Y to about here, E to extrude, and I'll just start rotating them into position. I can't press S to scale because they'll all come in together. So I need to come up to my transform pivot and change it to individual origins and scale those down from here. And there we've got some claws. Let's just zoom out and see what that looks like. It looks good. They're a little bit square like this. So I'll press Alt-Z and select the end faces here like this. So you can see what I've got selected there, and R then Z, and rotate that round slightly. Let's just come to the top to make sure it's not overlapping. I'll press G, then Shift Z, so it doesn't move in the Z axis. So it points out at this slight angle like this. I can do the same for the other side, just here. Just make sure you don't get any extras that you don't need. Probably don't need the bottom face either. R then Z to rotate that round, and G, then Shift Z, so I don't move in the Z axis. And that gives it a nice angle to the foot like this. I'll press Alt-Z to go back to solid mode and see what we've got. And now's a good time to catch up with me and create the claws for your dinosaur. Pause the video and have a go at that. Now I think the bottom of the foot is still a little bit too flat. So again, if we look at this reference image, this one's heels come up quite a lot. This one's heels are quite flat though. This one here has a heel that goes really high, and it tends to vary a bit, but it looks like the better ones have a much higher heel going upwards. Definitely not this one at the bottom here though. So back to Blender, into side view, Alt-Z, and select that bottom face there and bring it up slightly. And I can, of course, select all these and rotate them a bit and just adjust this shape slightly until I feel it's working. So Alt-Z to go back to front view. Now I moved these ones here and here down slightly, but because there's no loop cut going all the way around, that didn't work. So I'll undo that, and you can see they're back up to the same height. That makes more sense. Having a good look around now and making some minor adjustments here and here, I would say. Now that's not scaling the X because I've got my individual origins on still. So medium point, scaling the X and bring those in to somewhere around there. It's got very sort of wide feet at the moment, so I might go even further with that and just adjust certain areas accordingly. That looks a bit better. And I think this is working fairly nicely. The last thing I think to do with the leg is just to bring these ones in a bit because they don't quite look right sticking all the way out there. And possibly the top. I'll edge slide, so GG, edge slide it up to there. I think that looks a little bit better. Okay, back to object mode. Let's hide our reference. And I'll just move the 3D cursor because it's a bit distracting. But there we have what I think are some fairly good looking legs there. So your challenge once again is to just modify the shape, make sure you're happy with it. Do look at some references as well and see whether you want sort of chunky feet or bigger claws and those sort of things. It's entirely up to you what you find in your reference and what you think looks good. Once you've done that, make sure you've saved your work, ready for next time. In this video, we'll be making the dinosaur arms and working on the face. So here's where we got up to last time, and I'll bring back my references, and we'll start by modeling the arm. So into edit mode, I'll zoom in just a touch, and I'll go to face mode, and of course we can't use this face here because it's joined to this one over here. So again, extruding out wouldn't work, and it looks a little bit strange. Incidentally, I turned clipping off a while ago, so I'll turn that back on, make sure they clip together, so E to extrude, and they should stick together. So I'll undo that. It's much better to have a space in here, so this one is far more suitable. So to side view, Alt-Z to go to X-ray mode, I'll zoom in on that, and I'll zoom in on that area in our front view as well, like this. I'll just quickly go to vertex mode with 1 on my keyboard and just adjust some of these so they're a little bit closer to the beginning of the arm like this. Then I'll select that face. I'll come across the side view for this, E to extrude outwards, just a small amount, somewhere around there. And then again, we take this front face here. I'll come out of X-ray mode now, so Alt-Z, so you can see it a bit easier. And I'll turn this one to side view for a moment and zoom in on that area. So E to extrude, and I can just scale this down, so it's roughly in line. E to extrude, G to grab and scale it down again, and E to extrude and scale it down to somewhere around here. And it's looking relatively okay in front view. I like the way they actually come into the body like this. The only thing to do is in the top here, it's looking very boxy. So I can go to edge mode, select that edge there, GG to edge slide and GG to edge slide back again. So we've got a bit more of a rounded arm there. We can't round out the arm much more unless we Control R and do a loop cut all the way around. I think that's a bit overboard. We don't really need it for these front arms here. So I'll undo that. And if we take a look, although it looks a little bit boxy, it has a low poly feel to it. I think they're absolutely fine. I might just scale this one inwards so it's got a little bit more roundness to the top there. And I think that works well. Okay, so pause the video here and have a go at making the arms in the same way as I've done. So let's work on the head now then. I'm just going to even out these edge loops along here. So 2 to go to edge mode, Alt left click and GG to edge slide. And this one as well, GG to edge slide. I think also it's got a very fat neck. Just looking at some references here of the head and neck. This one here looks like it goes in a fair bit more. Same here. So I think we can bring our neck in slightly. So 3 to go to face mode, select this face loop around here and scale it down slightly. And G to grab in the X. Remember, you can't scale very easily when you've got a mirror modifier on because it's taking the median point of these faces. So I always press G to grab to move it inwards. and with clipping turned on, it should still be joined in the middle there and act a bit more like a scale. So that looks a bit better. Now let's zoom into the head. Before I start the head, make sure you've caught up with me, just adjusting the neck if necessary. Pause the video and have a go at that if you need to. Now the head itself is looking okay. We just need to put an eye into this area here and maybe a little bit of modification just so that eye sits correctly. So I'll go to side view, Alt-Z to go to X-ray mode and zoom in on that area. And to create the eye shape, I could use the knife tool to cut an area in here. However, a great way for quickly creating more topology in an area is to select the faces around that area and eye to inset. So suddenly I've got a lot more vertices to play with. Now, if your inset isn't looking like mine, so all the faces joined together, just make sure you press I again for individual. That will turn off individual if it's already on. And I'll just come into there and start modifying them. So one to go to vertex mode, and I'll just create a little bit of space, move this one down a little bit, somewhere around here, and these ones right up around here. Now I'm going to change this view into perspective, so Alt-Z over here, and just come around here and see what we've got. And this certainly needs a bit of modification, so G then X to move those across to somewhere like this. And we've got a bit of an eye shape there. Again, a little bit of modification here. And we've got an eye shape there. We don't have to be overly detailed. This is a low poly shape, so we're just indicating that there is an eye socket here. I'll take this vert here and G then X and move that in, and G then Z to move it down. And that's not looking too bad. It's looking a little bit surprised at the moment though. In order to make something look a bit more aggressive and angry, you tend to point the front of the eye down slightly like this, so it looks more aggressive. And a bit more of a squint helps as well, so bringing the eye in like this. And that's a bit better. We'll probably just need these ones to come across a little bit this way, and maybe that back one to come over a little bit more, because otherwise it won't be able to see out of the front here. And that's not looking too bad. Okay, so pause the video here and have a go at creating the eye socket. Remember to select those 4 faces around the eye socket, inset them, and then move those vertices around the eye. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, you may want to make some changes to the mouth here. I'm just using perspective mode in this one now because it's a little bit bigger. Generally, we're looking okay, I would say. Again, look at your reference and make sure you're happy with the shape. Perhaps these ones coming down here a little bit more. Not that it will make too much difference, but I think a thinner lower jaw makes more sense. Perhaps these ones coming in a little bit more. So I'll GG and edge slide those, but not much modification needed. You can look at the reference in front view, but I think it's best just to look at a few references online. So I've just typed in T-Rex head just to give me a rough guide of what I'm looking at. And you can see lots of these have fairly narrow fronts like this one here, and this one here as well. So you might want to make any adaptations to your head at this point, making sure you're happy with the shape. I'm trying to make it look fairly angry. So pause the video here and make sure you're happy with the shape of your head, because it's much easier to make modifications to the mouth once the head is finished. Okay, so to complete the mouth, we'll come around to the front here. I'll go to face mode and select these faces inside the mouth here. And I'll deselect the faces at the back. Not sure why they got selected, in fact. I think that's a bug. And I need to inset them with I. So I to inset. Now notice it's creating faces down the middle here, and I don't want that. So I'll undo, and I'll press I to inset, and B for boundary. That will inset it, but it will exclude the boundary from that inset. And the boundary is the mirror's edge, as it were. So now I'm at this point. I want to extrude this and kind of dig it in to the mouth. Now the way we do that is with Alt-S. So if I press Alt-S, it scales according to the normals of the face. So that can go inwards, but I need to extrude it first. So I'll undo that. But Alt-S is scale along the normals. And remember, the normals is the direction the face is facing. However, if I press E to extrude and then left click and then Alt-S, it doesn't create an extrusion. So I'll undo that. That's because I've got auto merge vertices on. So when I press E to extrude and enter or left click to set that, and then try and press Alt-S, it automatically merged all those vertices that I created with my extrusion together because they were sitting on top of each other. So again, I'll undo any changes, turn off auto merge vertices and press E to extrude and left click. So we've got an extrusion there. So if I press G to grab, you can see that extrusion. Now I can press Alt-S and bring those up slightly into the mouth like this. Not too far because otherwise we'll get overlapping geometry. So just a little bit like this, should work fine. You might want to G then X to move those in a little bit like this, and then Alt S once again to give it a little bit more room. So G to grab and move them in, and then Alt S again so they don't overlap on the outside here. So we've got the inside of the mouth there. So pause the video and create the inside of the mouth like I have here. Now the tiny bit of skin that joins these together is a little bit awkward to make, and I wouldn't really suggest that for a beginner. Don't follow along with this, but if I were to make that, I would select these faces here, delete them, and then start rebuilding by selecting these two here, fill in that face so we've got some sort of skin fold here, and then I can select this, E to extrude, pull that into the middle and join these faces together. So F to fill, and this one here, F to fill. Once I've got that, I can go to face mode, select these three faces, I to inset, and E to extrude backwards, scale that down a bit, and select this edge loop here, and just smooth that out a bit so it comes in like this. That's one way of making that sort of skin fold, as you can see there, and so on and so forth. And it would still need a bit of tidying up from there. So I'll undo those steps and come back to where we were, because we don't really need to model that much detail. It doesn't really add a lot to the shape. However, I would like a long tongue, so I'll select this face here, I'll inset it with I, and notice the boundary is still turned off. If I come down to here, you can see that boundary is still deselected, so it sticks in the middle. I'll minimize that, and then I can press E to extrude to pull that outwards, and G to grab to move that across here. I'll scale it down and rotate it, and scale in the Z, and just modify the shape slightly, and then E to extrude, so we've got a tongue coming right out here, and I'll scale it at the end there. Now when I extruded here, they stuck together. That's a little bit awkward, so I'm going to undo those steps and just flatten this out a bit. So scale in the Y-axis 0, and that will flatten it out a touch. I'll press G to grab in the X as well to make it a bit wider, and then E to extrude, and then scale in the Z to make it a bit smaller there. So just be careful when they come into the middle there and stick together. It's a little bit awkward to separate them, so it's just easier to undo it. And there we have our dinosaur's face. So your last challenge then is to catch up with me and create the tongue. And of course, now we've finished the dinosaur shape, make any modifications and changes that you want to the shape, trying to match it up with the reference images now that we've got all the vertices that we want. You might want a bigger head, smaller feet, bigger tail, or anything like that. That's entirely up to you. Once you've done that, make sure you saved your work, ready for next time. In this lecture, we'll be adding a landscape for our dinosaur to stand on. Okay, so here's where we got up to last time, and I'm going to come across to my references and hide those because we don't need them anymore, and I'll minimize that collection. Also, I'm in edit mode, so I'll press tab to go to object mode, and I'm fairly happy with how our dinosaur is looking here. We can always make changes a little bit later on. So I'm going to zoom out a touch, and I'm going to rotate the dinosaur in the Z-axis 90 degrees, so we are along the X-axis here, and I can build my landscape around them here. It keeps us generally in front view facing this way, which is easier when understanding the Cartesian coordinates. I'm going to add in a floor, so I'll press Shift A to add, mesh, and instead of a plane, this time I'll show you what the grid is like. So I'll choose the grid, and down here we've got some options, and we can add in some subdivisions. So for this, if I click and drag over both them and choose 100, this plane now has 100 by 100 faces. I'll zoom in on it and go to edit mode, and you can see all those faces. That means we'll be able to sculpt it nice and easily for our landscape. I'll come out of edit mode, I'll press Alt G to move it back into the center, and I'll scale it up 30 times so it's nice and big. So S then 30. I'll also minimize the dialog box at the bottom here. So once again, into edit mode, we've got all these faces that we can sculpt with. And again, that's the difference between a grid and a plane. You can actually set the amount of faces it has. If for any reason you felt like you didn't have enough faces, you can always select all and right click, and there's a subdivide option there, and you've got some options down here. The number of cuts, if it's one cut, that means it's dividing every face into 4. So be careful with the amount of cuts that you use if you've got a high number. But I'll undo that, and I'll go back to object mode, and then I'll go into the sculpting workspace. I'll zoom out a bit, and what I want to create is some mountains in the background here. I'll bring out my brushes so you can see those, and I'll start off with the grab brush. But before I start sculpting, it's a good idea to catch up with me, so pause the video here, add in a grid for the floor, giving it 100 by 100 subdivisions, scaling it up about 30 times, so it's roughly the same size as mine, and going across to the sculpting workspace. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so with my grab brush selected, I'll make my brush nice and big with F. Remember your controls are over here as well, maybe a bit bigger still, and I'll bring the landscape up like this. And I'm just creating some mountains in the background, and you can see why we needed all those faces in the grid. It will stretch a bit, but that doesn't matter because we'll change the surface later on. Now what I'm trying to avoid is pulling the edges up too far, so I don't want to be doing this sort of thing. It doesn't actually make too much difference, but if I ever wanted to use this area as a mountain and cut it out, I really want the edges to be level, so I'll undo that change. And I've already got some okay looking mountains there. I'll make my brush a little bit bigger and just move around the floor around the dinosaur so it's a little bit like there's some hills and undulations in front and around them. And that's looking about right. So pause the video here and catch up with me creating some mountains in the background and some just general undulations around our dinosaur. Okay, so that's all we need to do in sculpt mode, but it does look very smooth at the moment because we've got lots of faces. And for our final mountains, we want them to have that chunky low poly look. That's easy to change. I'll go back to layout mode. We don't really need this side window for now, so I can click and drag to minimize that and make my perspective nice and big. And with my plane, or grid in this case selected, I can go across to the modifiers tab here, the spanner, and add modifier, and we're going to use the decimate modifier. The decimate gives you a face count here, so we've currently got 10,000 faces, and we can use this ratio button here, just click and drag on that. If you're finding that a bit clunky, and it's a little bit awkward, you can always type a number in here as well, so click and type in something like 0.1 for example. And if I zoom in now, you can see it's reducing the poly count of our mesh, and you can see the face count down here. I need to go a fair bit lower to give it that nice low poly feel, so I'll left click on this and go 0.01 this time, so it's much lower and it's got a really nice looking low poly feel now with only just under 200 faces. So I think that's about right. So pause the video here and add a decimate modifier to your grid. I might want to edit the shape slightly, but if I go into edit mode, we'll see all our polygons again. That's because this is a modifier, so it's modifying these faces and reducing them. If I go back to edit mode and I want to actually change the faces that we see here, I will have to apply this modifier. But remember, it's a good idea to create a copy whenever you do something destructive like applying a modifier. So I'll rename this landscape. I'll create a duplicate, so Shift D to duplicate and press enter, and you can see our duplicate there, landscape 001. And I'll rename this by double clicking and call it landscape original. And I usually like to put that into a spares folder, so move to new collection, and spares. You might call yours something else. I'll minimize that and hide it from the viewport and the render so it doesn't suddenly appear when we start rendering. I'll click on my landscape that I want to apply the modifier to and come down to the modifiers and Control A to apply. Now when I go into edit mode, we can adapt this shape if we want to, and maybe go into vertex mode and pull a few of these vertices around, maybe making a more mountainous shape. So pause the video here and catch up with me, creating a duplicate that you can put into a spares folder, and then applying the modifier to our landscape object. Okay, so lastly, I may want to modify this a little bit more, so perhaps go into X-ray mode for this, maybe even turn on proportional edit, that's optional, and then select some vertices, G to grab, change my circle of influence, and maybe start pulling these around. It's a little bit like sculpt mode this, and create some sort of mountainous looking effect in the background there. And I like the look of that, so I'll come back into object mode and turn off X-ray, and I think that's working well. So your challenge then is to make any changes that you want to the landscape to make it look more mountainous in the background. Once you've done that, make sure you've saved your work, ready for next time. In this lecture, we'll be adding the trees, adding materials, and thinking about lighting setups to create atmosphere. Okay, so here's where we got up to last time. And in our final image, we want some trees behind our dinosaurs and then mountains in the background. The trees are very simple. They're just an elongated pyramid. And we could use a particle system for this, which would spread the trees on the surface of our landscape, but it's more overcomplicated than we need, and we can just place a few trees behind our dinosaur. Particle systems within Blender are becoming a little old-fashioned, and geometry nodes are more common now for creating things like grass and forests. And they are quite complicated for beginners. But if you are interested in that sort of thing, then geometry nodes is what you'll need to look into. So for now, I'm going to press Shift A to add and mesh, and then I can choose a cone for this, and I can bring the vertex count right down to 4. I'll zoom in on that so you can see it, and G to grab in the Z to bring it up like that. And you can see my pyramid, and then I can scale in the Z to make it nice and tall like this. And once again, G to grab to bring it up above the surface like this. Now, when I scale, it's scaling from the middle, so it's much better to have the origin at the bottom of the pyramid. So as a quick challenge, I want you to first catch up with me and place in a cone with only 4 vertices, so it becomes a pyramid, and move the object origin to the base of that cone so that it scales from the bottom. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so the 2 ways of doing it are to come up to the options and change the origins there, or go into edit mode, select all, and G to grab in the Z and move them upwards. Now my circle appears there, so just remember you may have proportional editing on. I'll turn that off for now. So we've got the object origin at the bottom there. I'll go back into object mode and again place this on the floor somewhere around here. It's possibly a little bit tall, so I'll bring it down so it's just above the height of the dinosaur, just there. Okay, so how can I quickly make lots of them? Well, I'll go to top view, Alt D to duplicate, rotate it slightly and scale it slightly. So we've got a little bit of variation there. Then I'll select both of them, Alt D, move them across to the side. Remember, this is Alt D, so they're linked duplicates. And I'll change the transform pivot point to individual origins. Then I can rotate them individually, and maybe these ones I'll scale down slightly to somewhere around here. Then I'll select 4 of them, Alt D, move them across, just add a little bit of rotation. Then select all of them, deselect the landscape, and I probably don't need to add too much more variation now, and I can just press Alt D and duplicate these a few times, just removing any overlap. I can select them all now, just deselect the light and the background there, Alt D, move them over to here, and you can see we've got some trees in the background there. So it's a nice simple way of doing a very basic forest like that. So pause the video and catch up with me and create a small forest in the background. Okay, so now let's position our camera. So 0 on the numpad to go to camera view. Remember, you've got your camera up here as well. N to bring up my toolbar, into view and lock camera to view. And I can now start moving my camera around into position. And that looks a fairly nice position there. Perhaps I want to see all the mountain though, so maybe back to here somewhere. That looks quite good. And I can decide to scale up my dinosaur if I want to, grab him in, but hold down Shift Z. Maybe move him right forward like this. So something around here looks quite interesting. Just make some minor adjustments to the camera. Might like to have that mountain a bit more in the middle there, so I'll move my dinosaur back a little bit this way. And maybe rotate the dinosaur around so it's facing this way slightly as well. Slowly getting there, just a little bit more adjustment. Some around there looks quite nice, I think. Now just a quick note on composition, I'm using what's called the rule of thirds here. So my dinosaur is on the left hand side and my mountain in the background is on the right hand side and its head is in the top third there. There's lots of really useful guides for composition. A great area to look up is photography composition, that will give you some great guides. And there's a link with this lecture so you can look it up for yourself. But generally finding a camera angle with both the dinosaur and the background in that you like the look of will work just fine for this lecture series. So take a moment to catch up with me and move your camera into a position where you can see the background and the dinosaur. And you may want to take a look at those composition guides to give you an idea of good composition. Pause the video and have a go at that. Of course, my dinosaur is digging into the floor slightly. That's fairly easy to change. I'll come out of camera view, click on the floor, into edit mode, and just bring down some of these vertices here and here. So G then Z, move those down. Perhaps this one as well, G then Z. I could of course bring the dinosaur up as well, but I was quite pleased with how it sat in my final composition. This is just if you did want to see the floor. So back to object mode. Okay, so let's get some basic colors onto our object. So I'll go to the shading workspace. I'll come to camera view again, and I can get rid of these side windows here by clicking and dragging my main 2 windows over the top of them. I'll start with the trees as they're nice and simple. So select the tree, create a new material. I'll call this green, and let's just change the color across to green. So we've got fairly vivid colours in our final image, and they seem to suit the scene, so I'll come across the green around here, just make it a little bit darker, possibly somewhere around there. I'll probably adjust these slightly once I get the lights in as well. Then I'll go for the dinosaur, new material, I'll call this red. It's more reddy brown, but we'll see how we go. So I'll bring this down to the reds, perhaps across the orange slightly, and just down in the tone to somewhere around here. And then we've got the mountains in the background. Now in our final image, there's a gradient texture, which I'll talk about in a later lecture. But for now, we'll just give this a basic material. So I'll click on that. And for now, I'll call it mountain. And just give it a slightly off-white color somewhere around here. And like I say, we'll adapt those and change that later on. So pause the video here and catch up with me and texture your objects similar to how I've done here. Now at the moment it seems fairly flat, and that's a lot down to the lighting. Currently we're lit by this HDRI in the background, which is giving a fairly even spread of light, which you can see in the background here. If I change to rendered mode, we get something that's far more dramatic. I wouldn't say it's quite how I would want it, but having a single light in the scene like this creates lots of contrast, so light spots and dark spots, and lots of shadows. So it could be quite a good idea for our final render to have one light source giving lots of shadows like this. The artistic use of shadows is known as chiaroscuro, and again it's a term used lots in film and photography. So I'll take our single light source and I'll change it with the light settings over here to a sun. Now it's kept the strength of the point light, which was 1000, but that's way too high for a sun. If I turn this down to 1, that would make a lot more sense. Then I've got to think about the direction. I want to be able to look at my final scene here through the camera, so I'll bring out a new window by clicking and dragging in the corner here, and I'll zoom in so I can see mainly my camera there. And then come out of camera view in this one and go to top view, because then I can change the direction of my sun by pressing R to rotate like this. And that's looking quite interesting. Maybe a steeper angle to make longer shadows, something like this. And that's already working fairly well. I'll go to top view again and experiment a little bit more with the angles. Something like that looks quite nice, I think. So being lit from the side is creating quite a lot of interest in the scene. Let's go across to our render settings and turn on the ambient occlusion and the screen space reflections. It's not making a huge amount of difference in our scene, but it is helping somewhat. So pause the video here and take a moment to catch up with me, turning your light into a sun lamp, and you might want to change your shading layout so it's similar to mine. Okay, so we've got some reasonable shadows coming from this light, but it's a little bit too dark in places, so we probably need another light source in our scene. So I'll keep it fairly simple and I'll copy the sun across to the other side. So Shift D to copy it, because I'm going to change this light slightly and rotate it around the other way. So it's pointing from the other direction. So you can see those two pointing inwards like this. Now you might think, well, that's impossible. Why would you have two suns? What I'm actually doing is using this sun as kind of the bounce light. So we've got our key light here, which is imitating my sun. And I'll go back to the light properties here, and I might want to make this one a little bit stronger, so it's maybe something like 2. Whereas this one here is going to be the bounce light, as if it's hit objects from the other side and it's bouncing back. So I'm going to turn this down to 0.3. And I might want to change the color a bit, so change it across maybe so it's a bit more yellowy. And this one, as a little bit of contrast, will have a little bit more blue. And you can see it's added a fair bit more atmosphere to my scene. Now I'm going to adjust the light slightly, so I'll rotate it a bit and see what that looks like. Just rotate it around the Z slightly as well, just to see the different effects that I can get from that. And something like that looks quite good, I think. So pause the video here and duplicate your sun lamp, move it across to the other side so it's pointing from the other direction, and maybe experiment a little bit with the color and angle. I feel like our dinosaur is a little bit dark compared to the rest of the scene, and I want them to stand out a little bit more. So I'll duplicate this light again. I'm keeping it nice and simple and keeping it to sunlights for the sake of ease, just because they've got a simple direction and nothing more. I'll move this across so it points down onto the dinosaur a bit and change the strength back to 1. We've got a few more highlights around the eye now and the top of the dinosaur, and that looks slightly better. And the scene is looking slightly more complete now. Okay, so your challenge then is to set up the last light that's pointed down onto the dinosaur. And I want you to have a bit of an experiment with these 3 lights, see if you can get some interesting angles working, maybe change the color of the light to change the look and feel of the scene. and just see how you get on and what suits you. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so lastly, I want a background. It's really grey at the moment and a bit dull. So let's go across to Object and then World. This is in the Shader tab. And I'll change this across to a sort of browny colour, but certainly make it a bit lighter, somewhere around here. Let's change the scene quite drastically. So I can change the strength just to see the impact that has as well, and vary the colour and saturation a bit to try and create an atmosphere once again. So possibly something around there. So I've got a strength of 0.6 because I don't want to lighten my scene up too much, but I'll show you ways of adding contrast a little bit later on. So we're certainly getting there. I'll probably want to tinker with the lights a lot more once I've got the mountains in the background complete, and we might want to change some of the composition elements slightly as well. But for now, make sure your work is saved, ready for next time.